12 engineers had already failed to explain why the CEO's jet refused to move, and the deal that would save thousands of jobs was only hours from collapse. When the specialists blamed a software glitch and shrugged, Elias Rourke, a single father who spent his nights repairing baggage tractors, walked toward the aircraft and looked at it exactly once. Mocked for his oil-stained coveralls, he said only one sentence to the billionaire standing beside the wing: "Pay my daughter's hospital bill, and I will make this airplane fly." No one in that hangar knew he was the man who had designed the very system now being turned against her. If you love a quiet man refusing to be underestimated, press subscribe and stay with us for the rest of this story. The private jet belonging to Lenora Bancroft touched down at Black Ridge Executive Airfield in Montana a little after midnight, its engines still ticking with heat from an inspection tour of one of her energy projects, and the plan had always been simple: a short refueling stop before the long overnight leg to New York. The pilots ran the standard restart sequence without concern, expecting nothing more dramatic than a coffee break on the tarmac. But the moment the systems came alive, every screen in the cockpit turned the same shade of warning red. The engines themselves purred exactly as they should, healthy and strong, yet the flight computer refused to release control of the taxiway, locking the aircraft in place as though it no longer trusted its own hands. Ground technicians swarmed the cabin within minutes, pulling panels, checking fuses, testing sensors, and running diagnostic after diagnostic without finding a single physical fault worth naming. Graham Kessler, the director of the flight department, kept pushing them toward another reboot instead of letting anyone open the deeper wiring behind the avionics bay, insisting the fix was only a matter of patience. Lenora, meanwhile, took a call from her own boardroom and learned she had less than 6 hours to reach New York before an entire deal worth billions slipped away from her, and every option she considered next evaporated as quickly as she raised it. Victor Langford, her chief financial officer, offered his sympathy over the phone with practiced warmth, telling her he would gladly step in and handle the closing himself if the jet could not be repaired in time. And something about the ease of that offer made her jaw tighten even before she understood why. She refused him outright and ordered her assistant to call every aviation specialist within 300 miles, certain that money and urgency together could solve anything. A helicopter did not have the range. The nearest commercial flight would land an hour too late, and the weather over the mountains was already grounding backup charters one by one. While the search for outside help stretched thinner, a maintenance worker in a stained gray uniform stood near a broken luggage tractor not far from the hangar, listening to something the specialist inside had missed entirely. A faint relay clicking on a rhythm no untrained ear would ever notice. That rhythm meant something specific to Elias Rourke, a pattern he had once built into a protective circuit years earlier, under a different name, in a different life, before everything he had worked for was taken from him in a single afternoon. A security guard waved him back from the aircraft without a second glance, assuming a ground crew technician had no business near a jet worth nearly $100 million, and Elias did not argue the point. Wade Hollis, the shift supervisor who had worked beside him for 3 years, noticed the way Elias had gone still and asked quietly if he recognized the problem. Elias only said that the engineers inside were looking in the wrong place entirely, then turned back toward his half-finished repair as though the matter had nothing to do with him. Through the open cabin door, just before he walked away, he caught the flicker of a diagnostic light, blinking in a sequence he remembered erasing from his own original design 7 years earlier, a pattern that should not have existed anywhere in the world anymore. His phone rang before he reached the tractor again, and the voice on the other end belonged to the billing office of the hospital where his daughter Avery was scheduled for a delicate cardiac procedure the next morning. The deposit, $86,000 needed to clear before 7, or her place in the surgical schedule would be given to another patient and she would wait weeks she did not have. Elias asked for even a single extra day and was told, gently but firmly, that the policy allowed no exceptions for anyone. Avery called only minutes later, her voice carefully light, offering to postpone the procedure herself so her father would not have to borrow against anything. She had a way of sounding cheerful precisely when she was most worried, a habit he recognized because he had taught it to her without ever meaning to. The two of them practiced at protecting each other from the same worries at the same time. He told her the insurance matter was already being resolved, and he kept his tone steady enough that she believed him completely, or at least steady enough that she chose not to push further. After the call ended, he opened his banking application and watched another emergency loan request come back denied, the numbers on the screen unmoved by how much he needed them to change. He sat for a moment in the cold air beside the tractor, running through every option he had already exhausted twice that week, and found, as he had every time before, that none of them had grown any larger since the last time he counted. Inside the hangar, a third team of engineers concluded that the entire flight computer might need replacement, a repair that would take at least 2 days the company simply did not have. Lenora's patience finally broke, and she demanded to know whether a single person on that airfield actually understood the aircraft in front of them. Wade brought Elias forward without hesitation, and Graham let out a short, dismissive laugh the instant he learned the newcomer usually repaired luggage carts and generators rather than jets. Lenora studied the grease staining his sleeves and asked if this was meant to be some kind of joke at her expense. Elias did not defend his appearance or explain his history, choosing instead to ask the pilot 3 precise questions about the exact order in which the error codes had first appeared. Captain Dean Calloway blinked in surprise, because those questions touched details no specialist that night had thought to request. Details that mattered only to someone who understood the architecture underneath the warning lights, rather than the warning lights themselves. Elias listened to the sound of the relays, checked the temperature along one panel with the back of his hand, and timed the restart cycle against his own memory of how such a system should behave when it was healthy. He told Lenora plainly that nothing on the aircraft was actually broken, that the machine was instead being fed false information from somewhere inside its own wiring, and that whoever built the false signal understood the architecture far better than a random saboteur ever could. Then he said the sentence that would follow him for the rest of that night and long after it. Pay my daughter's hospital bill directly to the hospital, not to me, and once they confirm the payment has cleared, I will make this airplane fly again. Lenora's first instinct was suspicion, certain that a man in a stained uniform was exploiting her crisis for a quick payday, and Graham immediately urged her to have him removed from the hangar before he could do any real damage. Elias turned to leave without protest, pausing only to warn her that she had roughly 4 hours before the false signal locked the entire maintenance mode beyond anyone's reach, technician or otherwise. As he reached the door, every error code on the cockpit displays vanished at once, exactly as he had just described, and the silence that followed said more than any argument could have. Tessa Monroe, Lenora's chief of staff, asked security to pull whatever records existed on the stranger who had just walked out of the hangar with such quiet certainty. What came back surprised everyone in the room: a master's degree in aerospace electronics, 3 patents filed under his own name, and years spent as lead engineer at Halcyon Flight Systems designing protective architecture for high-end private jets. The same file also noted an old internal investigation into a data leak that had ended his career there, though no formal charges were ever filed against him. Graham seized on that detail immediately, arguing that a man once suspected of leaking sensitive flight data was exactly the kind of person who might now be causing deliberate harm. Wade pushed back hard, reminding everyone that Elias had not so much as touched the aircraft before the failures began, and that timeline alone should matter more than a 7-year-old rumor. Tessa kept digging and found the original inquiry had closed for lack of evidence, along with a quiet settlement payment Halcyon had made to Elias shortly after his dismissal, the kind of payment companies rarely make to someone they truly believe is guilty. Lenora was not ready to trust him yet, so she asked him to explain the failure without laying a single hand on the aircraft itself, testing whether his knowledge was real or simply well-rehearsed. Elias sketched the data architecture across a whiteboard someone dragged from a nearby office, showing how 3 independent sensors could never produce an identical fault within the same fraction of a second unless something downstream had altered their signal on purpose. A senior engineer in the room examined the sketch and quietly admitted the reasoning held together better than anything the earlier teams had proposed. Graham tried once more to stop anyone from removing the interior panels, warning that doing so could void the aircraft's certification and create new problems entirely. Elias reminded Lenora that he was not asking her to trust him blindly, only offering a clear and simple exchange with nothing hidden inside it. She stepped away and called the hospital herself, confirming the patient's name, the file number, and the exact amount owed, her voice clipped with the effort of doing something she still did not fully understand. When the hospital confirmed the full $86,000 had cleared, Elias closed his eyes for just a moment, then called his daughter to tell her the procedure would happen exactly as scheduled. That call was the only time his voice nearly broke all night, and afterward he asked everyone but Wade and the captain to clear the electronics bay so he could finally begin real work. When the first interior panel came free, a bundle of wiring caught his attention immediately, one that appeared in none of the aircraft's official maintenance diagrams, tucked behind the entertainment system as though it had every right to be there. He traced it to a small data module carrying the label of a legitimate parts supplier, though its serial number had been carefully filed away. Graham insisted it was simply a converter installed during a recent entertainment system upgrade, nothing more than that. Elias asked why an entertainment converter would ever need a direct connection to the flight control data line, and Graham had no answer ready. Studying the circuitry more closely, Elias recognized the underlying structure immediately, because he was the one who had first designed it, a protective framework once called Sentinel Loop that he had built years earlier to isolate exactly this kind of false signal before it could ever reach a cockpit. Lenora asked how he could possibly be so certain, and Elias told her the truth without softening it, that he had designed the original architecture himself at Halcyon before a superior tried to turn its protective core into a remote access shortcut meant to cut maintenance costs. He had refused to certify that change because a remote gateway built into flight safety systems could just as easily be exploited by someone with the wrong intentions. Shortly after his refusal, confidential technical files were leaked from an account bearing his name, and the internal investigation that followed had been led, at the time, by a rising executive named Victor Langford. Lenora went very still at the mention of that name, because Victor now sat 2 floors above her own office as Chief Financial Officer of Bancroft Meridian. Graham quickly suggested Elias might simply be using the crisis to settle an old score against a man he blamed for ruining his career. Elias did not rise to the accusation, choosing instead to keep working, removing the hidden module from the data network with careful, deliberate hands, rather than rushing the job under pressure. He remembered the weeks after his dismissal more clearly than he wanted to, the way former colleagues stopped returning calls once his name appeared in an internal memo, the way recruiters grew polite and distant the moment they searched his employment history. His wife had still been healthy then, and the two of them had told each other it was only a setback, the kind of thing a strong marriage could absorb while he found his footing again somewhere else. He never did find that footing, not really, because every application eventually circled back to the same closed door, and after a while he stopped mentioning the rejections at all, choosing instead to take whatever work paid steadily and asked no questions about his past. Ground maintenance had been the quiet compromise, a trade of ambition for stability, and he told himself for years that the trade had been worth it as long as Avery never had to feel the weight of what he had lost. Standing in this hangar now, watching a system he had built with his own hands used as a weapon against a stranger, felt less like vindication and more like a door he had spent 7 years trying to keep shut swinging open against his will. He refused to power the system back on immediately, checking every remaining connection first to avoid triggering some secondary safeguard he had not yet identified. The rest of the ground crew grew visibly anxious as the deadline crept closer, and Lenora pushed him to move faster than he was willing to go. Elias told her plainly that he could help her reach New York a little late, or he could help her never make it there at all, and the choice belonged entirely to how carefully this was done. That single sentence silenced her completely, and she said nothing further as he finished his inspection. Once the module was fully disconnected, he restarted the system, and every warning across the cockpit displays disappeared at once. The engines confirmed clean readiness, the flight computer released the taxiway lock, and every engineer who had mocked him earlier now stood watching in stunned silence as the man in the oil-stained uniform proved them all wrong within minutes. Before anyone could celebrate, Elias checked the module's internal memory and found it had received an encrypted command less than 10 minutes before the aircraft ever landed that night, a signal sent by someone who knew Lenora's private schedule down to the minute. This had never been an accident or a random malfunction, and it had never been designed to destroy the aircraft either. It existed for exactly one purpose: to keep the jet grounded for precisely as long as someone else needed it grounded. Elias told Lenora, quietly enough, that only she and Tessa could hear him, that whoever wanted her to miss that meeting in New York might still be standing inside this very hangar. Lenora's expression shifted from relief to something colder, and she asked him to say nothing further until she understood exactly who among her own people she could still trust. Security investigators, working quickly under Tessa's direction, discovered the module's programming carried a technical signature that traced directly back to an old maintenance account under the name E. Rourke, one that had not been used in 7 years. Graham announced immediately that Elias must have planted the device himself, then staged its discovery to extract money from a woman desperate to save her own schedule. Lenora's suspicion returned in full force, and she asked Elias how he could possibly have known the aircraft would fail unless he was the one who had caused it. He admitted freely that fragments of his original code lived inside the sabotage, but insisted the design had been altered far beyond anything he had ever built. Pointing to a remote command function, his original architecture had been specifically engineered to prevent. A search of his personal locker turned up a small transmitter capable of sending the same kind of remote signal that had locked the aircraft in place, and the access log showed the locker had been opened using his own security badge. Wade argued furiously that someone must have planted it there, since Elias had spent the entire evening in plain sight, but the badge record alone was enough for Lenora to order him detained until federal investigators could arrive and sort out the truth for themselves. A younger security officer walked Elias to a small break room near the maintenance office and asked him to wait there, apologizing under his breath as though he did not fully believe the accusation either. Elias sat with his hands folded on the table, thinking not of the charges, but of Avery lying in a hospital bed in the morning, wondering if her father would even be free to sit beside her. He replayed the last hour in his mind, searching for the moment his badge had left his pocket, and remembered a brief jostle near the equipment cage earlier that evening, a stranger's shoulder bumping his own just hard enough to feel deliberate in hindsight. At the time he had dismissed it as nothing, one more small collision in a crowded hangar full of frightened, hurried people. Now it sat differently in his memory, less like an accident and more like the first quiet move in a plan built to end with him exactly where he was sitting. Elias studied the transmitter from a careful distance without touching it, noting a lithium battery still wrapped in its original shipping label, manufactured only 3 months earlier according to the printed date. The maintenance account bearing his name had been deactivated 7 years ago, yet the device's internal log claimed it had been programmed using that very account only 2 days prior, an impossibility unless someone had built an entirely fake account to imitate him. Tessa checked the system records and confirmed a new account had indeed been created using administrative access, reserved for the flight department, a privilege held by only Graham and 2 senior colleagues. Victor called Lenora directly at that moment, urging her to abandon the airfield entirely and let him represent the company at the closing in her place, insisting it was far too dangerous to continue flying on an aircraft that had already been sabotaged once that night. Elias noticed something strange in how casually Victor referenced the protective system by its old internal name, Sentinel Loop, a detail that had never been made public in any record he knew of. When pressed on how he knew that name, Victor claimed Graham had briefed him only moments earlier. But Tessa quickly checked Graham's call log and found no such conversation had ever taken place between the 2 men that night. Tessa stared at the phone log for a long moment before setting it down on the table between them, and nobody in the small circle around Lenora needed her to explain what its emptiness meant. Wade folded his arms and asked quietly how a man could quote the internal name of a safety system that had never once appeared in any press release, any court filing, or any public record anyone in that hangar could recall. Lenora did not answer him immediately, turning the question over the way she turned over balance sheets, looking for the seam where a convenient story stopped holding its own weight. She had known Victor for 11 years, had promoted him twice, had defended him once in front of her own father when doubts were raised about his ambition outpacing his patience. None of that history changed what her chief of staff had just proven with a single call log, and the realization sat in her chest like something cold settling into place. Elias proposed they let the deception continue rather than confront Graham directly, reasoning that whoever orchestrated this plan might reveal their next move if they still believed the aircraft was hopelessly grounded. Lenora agreed to let Tessa quietly inform Victor that repairs had failed completely, and a false travel update went out claiming she was switching to ground transportation with no realistic hope of reaching New York in time. Word reached the board that Victor might need to chair the closing meeting himself, and Graham visibly relaxed the moment he heard it, slipping away toward a maintenance corridor to make a private call he assumed no one would ever trace. Elias connected the recovered module to an isolated test system, carefully simulating a fully repaired aircraft without exposing the real flight systems to any further risk. Within minutes, a new remote command arrived, attempting to reactivate the exact failure they had just spent hours removing, confirming beyond doubt that someone was actively watching and waiting for the right moment to strike again. Security traced that signal directly to a tablet registered to Graham, who immediately insisted his device must have been compromised by someone else entirely. Elias examined the command's authentication requirements and found it required a live fingerprint scan to transmit, a security measure only Graham himself could satisfy. Even confronted with this evidence, Graham refused outright to say Victor's name aloud, clinging to a loyalty that no longer made any practical sense. Tessa located maintenance records showing Graham had personally rerouted a recent entertainment system upgrade through an outside contractor without standard board approval, a contractor operating under the name Red Haven Capital. Deeper investigation revealed Red Haven's ownership traced back to a company quietly run by Victor's own younger brother, connecting every thread of the sabotage to a single family. The plan had never simply been about making Lenora late for a meeting, but about ensuring that once Victor gained emergency control, he could sell off Bancroft Meridian's entire aviation division to Red Haven at a fraction of its true value, then resell the same assets months later for a fortune that would land quietly in his own accounts. Even with Graham cornered, time was slipping away faster than anyone in that hangar could control. The aircraft still needed a final inspection before it could safely leave the ground, and Lenora now had barely 40 minutes left to depart if she wanted any real chance of reaching New York before the deal expired. Elias warned that although the primary device had been removed, a backup trigger might still exist somewhere inside the aircraft, built precisely for a moment like this one. Lenora asked him directly whether the jet was truly safe to fly, and Elias told her he would only answer that question once his inspection was complete, even if the delay cost her the entire fortune riding on tonight's closing. As the aircraft began rolling slowly out of the hangar under its own power for the first time all night, a brand new warning flashed suddenly across the cockpit displays, this time originating from the fuel system rather than the flight controls. Lenora's frustration boiled over instantly, certain that Elias had somehow failed after all. But he noticed at once that this particular warning had never appeared while the aircraft sat motionless on the ground. It only activated the moment wheel sensors confirmed the jet was actually moving, a deliberate fail-safe designed to strand the aircraft even if the first sabotage device was found and removed entirely. Captain Calloway brought the jet to an immediate stop and returned it to the maintenance position without hesitation. Graham, cornered and out of options, still refused to reveal exactly where a second device might be hidden, forcing Elias to reason through the aircraft's layout on his own. He suspected it would sit somewhere close to the cabin's communication systems, a location able to receive outside signals, yet routinely skipped during standard avionics inspections, precisely because no one expected trouble there. Interior panels could not simply be torn apart wholesale with time running out, so Elias grabbed a handheld thermal camera and swept it methodically across the cabin, searching for any point generating heat that had no business being there. He found it hidden behind a small wine cabinet built into the aircraft's private lounge, a location clearly chosen because no inspector would ever think to look there on a billionaire's personal jet. Lenora remarked bitterly that whoever built this plan clearly understood exactly how invisible wealth could make certain corners of a life. Elias removed the second device carefully and discovered it had been engineered only to trigger a false alarm rather than physically interfere with the actual fuel supply. Still, if a pilot ever chose to override that alarm and continue flying anyway, a separate mechanism would automatically seal the fuel valve shut mid-flight, turning a false warning into a very real disaster. Working quickly, Elias found the wiring connected through a fuse that did not match any approved specification for the aircraft, forcing him to replace the entire section of cable rather than simply disconnect a single component. Wade knelt beside him, passing tools without needing to be asked, and for a stretch of several minutes neither man spoke while the rest of the cabin waited in tense silence. Lenora paced near the cockpit door, glancing at her watch every few seconds as though staring at it hard enough might slow the numbers down, and Tessa kept a running line open with the board to buy whatever minutes she could. Elias worked with the unhurried focus of a man who had learned long ago that panic never made a circuit close any faster. stripping the damaged section of cable back to clean copper before splicing in a replacement length pulled from the aircraft's own emergency kit. He tested the connection twice before trusting it, well aware that a single overlooked fault could undo everything he had already accomplished that night. When the fuel display finally settled into a steady, unblinking green, he allowed himself only a short breath before moving on to verify every remaining system one final time, refusing to let relief substitute for certainty. While he worked, Lenora asked quietly why he had never used his old settlement money to rebuild his career somewhere else after leaving Halcyon. Elias explained that most of it had gone toward his wife's medical care in the years before she passed away, and what remained had gone toward raising Avery and covering debts that never seemed to shrink no matter how carefully he managed them. He had applied to dozens of aviation companies over the years, always turned away once his old file surfaced during a background check, regardless of how strong his technical record otherwise looked. One of those companies, he added without any particular bitterness, had been Bancroft Aviation itself, and the rejection letter had carried an approval signature from Victor's own office. Lenora understood then that Victor had spent years quietly ensuring Elias could never again get close enough to the industry to prove what had really happened 7 years earlier, because a man capable of designing Sentinel Loop was also the only man capable of exposing how it had been twisted into a weapon. Elias finished the repair with less than 20 minutes remaining before the final possible departure window closed for good. Captain Calloway ran a complete systems check from nose to tail, and every display across the cockpit stayed calm and clear this time. Elias insisted on one additional ground cycle rather than an immediate takeoff, wanting absolute certainty rather than speed, and Lenora, despite every instinct urging her to rush, agreed without argument. The flight was cleared as fully safe, and Lenora asked Elias to join her aboard as a technical advisor for the remainder of the trip. He hesitated, thinking first of the hospital and the hours he still needed to be there, until Avery called to remind him gently that her procedure would not begin until noon, and that he should finish what he had started tonight. Elias agreed to fly with her on the condition that he would return home the moment the meeting concluded and the aircraft finally lifted off the runway while hundreds of miles away. Victor was already calling the board into an emergency session to declare Lenora unable to arrive on time. In a glass conference room high above New York, Victor informed the assembled board that a severe mechanical failure had left Lenora stranded far from the city, and he requested immediate emergency authority to act in her place. Margaret Winthrop, the chair of the board, asked calmly that everyone wait until the actual deadline had passed before taking any drastic action. Victor pressed harder, arguing that every additional minute risked the entire acquisition, and proposed abandoning the Orion Medical Transit deal entirely while selling off the aviation division to cover the resulting loss. He revealed that Red Haven Capital had already prepared a formal offer to purchase that division, a level of preparation so immediate that it struck Margaret as deeply suspicious rather than reassuring. The aircraft touched down with only minutes remaining before the deadline expired completely, and Lenora, Tessa, and Elias arrived at the conference room carrying the biometric authentication device required to finalize the court-supervised sale. Victor forced a smile and claimed genuine relief at seeing Lenora safe, though something in his voice failed to match the words. Lenora did not accuse him outright, choosing instead to let Elias lay out the full technical history of the sabotage device and the encrypted signals traced back to that very evening. Victor scoffed openly at the idea of a board taking direction from a man who spent his days repairing luggage tractors, and Elias replied evenly that Victor had once used that exact same contempt to bury him 7 years earlier, and it had not worked then either. Tessa presented the financial connections linking Red Haven Capital, Victor's younger brother, and the outside contractor who had installed the sabotage equipment during a routine upgrade. Graham, realizing Victor intended to let him absorb the entire blame alone, agreed to hand over a recorded exchange between the two men from earlier that week. In the recording, Victor instructed Graham to create, in his own words, a problem serious enough to keep her grounded, but nothing that would put anyone in real danger. Victor insisted the recording could easily have been fabricated, but Elias walked the board through the encrypted signature embedded inside the sabotage device itself, a signature generated using an administrative key reserved exclusively for the chief financial officer's own office. Margaret ordered the legal team to freeze every account and system tied to Victor immediately, ending any further debate about his intentions that night. Victor tried one final argument, turning to the rest of the board and insisting that even if every technical detail were true, none of it proved he had intended real harm to anyone aboard that aircraft. Elias answered him directly for the first time, all evening, his voice even and unhurried, saying that intention stopped mattering the moment a fuel system was rigged to fail mid-flight regardless of who was sitting in the cabin when it happened. A junior board member asked whether the second device could genuinely have brought the plane down, and Elias confirmed that if the pilot had overridden the false alarm at altitude rather than on the ground, the resulting fuel valve failure would have left the crew with very few options and very little time. The room went silent at that, several board members glancing toward Lenora, as though seeing for the first time exactly how close the evening had come to a different ending entirely. Margaret asked Victor if he had anything further to say for himself, and he offered nothing, staring instead at the table as security approached to escort him out. Lenora then produced older records pulled from Halcyon's own archive. Documents proving Victor had personally approved the creation of a fraudulent account under Elias's name during the very leak that destroyed his career 7 years earlier, in front of the same powerful people who had once dismissed him as an unstable engineer. Elias was finally and completely cleared. Victor was escorted from the boardroom without protest, his downfall unfolding in complete silence rather than in any dramatic confrontation. Lenora completed the biometric authentication for the Orion acquisition with only 40 seconds left on the deadline clock, securing the deal and the jobs it would protect just as the window closed behind her. In the weeks that followed, the Orion Medical Transit acquisition closed successfully, preserving thousands of jobs across its medical logistics network. Victor and Graham both faced formal investigation for corporate fraud, sabotage of company property, and attempted manipulation of the board, while Red Haven Capital was permanently barred from any future dealings with Bancroft Meridian. Elias's professional record was fully corrected at last, and Halcyon Flight Systems issued a public statement confirming he had never been responsible for the leak that once ended his career there. Every patent he had originally filed was formally restored to his name in full. Lenora met with him privately once the investigation had settled, admitting she had judged him entirely by his uniform and his job title rather than by anything he had actually done that night. She told him she had built her entire career on reading people quickly, trusting her instincts about who belonged in which room, and that instinct had failed her the moment it mattered most. Elias told her honestly that she was far from the first person to make that mistake, though she was welcome to become the last one inside her own company from that point forward. She offered him a substantial bonus well beyond what their original agreement had covered, and he turned down everything above that number without hesitation, reminding her that he had asked for a hospital bill to be paid, not for anyone's pity in return. Lenora then offered him something else entirely, a newly created position as Director of Aviation Systems Safety for the whole of Bancroft Meridian, reporting directly to the board with full authority to ground any aircraft showing signs of irregularity. Elias accepted on 3 conditions: that Wade and the rest of the ground crew receive advanced training and real opportunities for advancement, that any employee who raised a safety concern in good faith be fully protected from retaliation, and that every safety decision remain entirely independent of financial pressure from above. Lenora agreed to all 3 without hesitation, understanding by then exactly what kind of leadership had been missing from her company for far too long. Elias arrived at the hospital just before Avery was wheeled toward her procedure, and he chose not to mention the CEO, the deal, or the danger that had filled his entire night. He simply held her hand and told her the bill had already been taken care of. Avery asked what he had given up to make that happen, and Elias answered that this time all he really had to give was a reminder to everyone in that room of exactly who he truly was. 6 months later, Avery had fully recovered and returned to her studies, her recovery steady enough that her doctors described it as better than anyone in that hospital had dared to promise on the night of her procedure. Elias flew back into Blackridge Executive Airfield aboard the very same jet that had once been used against Lenora, this time wearing a jacket bearing the insignia of Bancroft Meridian's safety division, though he still stopped without thinking twice to help a young technician free a jammed tool cart on the tarmac. The younger man recognized him immediately and asked, somewhat sheepishly, whether the stories the ground crew told about that night were even half true, and Elias only smiled and told him to keep asking good questions, because that habit mattered more than any title ever would. When Lenora stepped off the aircraft, she overheard a newly hired supervisor snapping angrily at a ground crew member over a minor delay, and she corrected him on the spot, not because Elias happened to be standing nearby, but because she had finally learned that a company is only as safe as its willingness to listen to the people working closest to the machines themselves. She sold the old jet once the investigation fully closed, keeping only one item from it, the small module Elias had first pulled from its hidden wiring that night, now displayed quietly inside the boardroom as a permanent reminder of what arrogance can nearly cost. Beneath it sits a single plaque bearing one short line, noting that 12 specialists once saw only an error code, while one father saw the truth underneath it. New hires touring the building often pause at that case longer than at anything else on the entire floor, and more than one executive has learned to expect a pointed question about it during their very first week on the job. Avery called him not long after that trip, teasing that the next time he negotiated with a billionaire, he ought to ask for more than a single hospital bill. Elias smiled, looked out at the aircraft waiting for its next inspection, and told her that what he needed had never really been about the money at all. He reminded her that the two of them had already survived the hardest years without any of it, and that money had only ever been a way of buying back time they could not afford to lose. All he had ever needed, all along, was one honest chance to finally prove that people had been wrong about him, and for the first time in 7 long years, nobody who truly mattered doubted that about him anymore.
You have to craft it? It's pretty good. Attack like 3 times, they activate the heavy attack, the combo says. Alright. Let's try it out. I like when it's right next to it, bro. I honestly wanted to change my staff.
You challenge me without even letting me have dinner.
Oh, that's so fucking annoying. guy's fucking a dickhead, bro.